Good afternoon. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you again for this second series of lessons that Brother Phil asked me to present to you from here in Belington, West Virginia, and the congregation here sends its best wishes for the church in Springfield and the good work that you folks are doing there. We finished up the first of these lessons on the 3 chapters in the book of Job, or 4 chapters, 38 through 41. By the first lesson, we looked at the earth science portion, and at the end of it, we asked, could you have passed Job's science test? I've had the opportunity as a retired science teacher for 35 years to give many science tests at many different levels in earth sciences, geological sciences, human anatomy, and so on. But certainly, I do not believe I could have passed Job's science test, because God asked Job in chapter 38 so many questions that were beyond his capacity, his ability to be able to understand, that it was nothing short of amazing. Well, in this particular lesson, we're going to look at the biological sciences portion of Job's science test. And Job begins at the end of chapter 38, verses 39 to the end of the chapter, talking about animals that Job obviously maybe was more familiar with. And Job thought, I could imagine, when God told him in verse 1 and 2 to gird up thy loins, put on your big boy pants, tighten your belt, because I'm going to ask you some questions, that Job thought, man, the hard part's over with, because now God's going to start talking to me about the animals. And yet, Job's ability to understand the questions that God is going to ask Job about were just as difficult, just as hard, and maybe harder, because they get into areas things that even in the 21st, headed for the 22nd century, not too awful far down the road, we're still struggling with understanding these questions. So God is going to ask Job, and we're going to look at just a few of them. Again, time doesn't permit for me to cover all of these animals, but we're going to look at lions, ravens, horses, hawk, the ostrich and peacock, and then we'll try to save as much time as possible at the end for the questions about Behemoth and Leviathan, 2 creatures that today still bring a great deal of questions for mankind. And so we're going to get right into it, because time doesn't permit us to linger too long. God in verse 39 of Job chapter 38 says this to Job, wilt thou hunt the prey for the lion, or fill the appetites of the young lions, when they crouch in their dens and abide in the covert to lie in wait? And so God starts out asking Job about questions about the lions that obviously Job would have been, or apparently was familiar with, and asking Job, can you go out and can you hunt the food, hunt the prey items that, of course, lions are capable of hunting? And we know, of course, from studies that have been done, videos, movies that have been made, where they have watched packs of lions for 24 hours a day for weeks on end, that the society, the complexity of the hunting group of lions is nothing short of amazing. They obviously, without talking to one another, coordinate their attack. They look and analyze carefully, deciding which of the large group of gazelle, wildebeest, whatever they happen to be hunting, which one is the one that is the weakest, which one is the one that they're most likely to be successful with. And so the amount of intelligence that they have, and they're not using walkie-talkies, they're not using GPS, okay, now you go over to this location, you go over here, and we'll ambush these animals, and we're looking for the one that's sort of at the back of the pack. They don't do that, and yet somehow they're able to communicate and to be successful and to kill the animals that they need to be able to survive. And so the question that came to Job was from God, can you do this? And today I think even with our advanced communications, with our ability to look at to communicate among ourselves, a group of hunters would still be hard pressed to match the coordination and the ability that lions have to be successful in their hunting. Well, and of course the prey for the lion, of course the lions will eat just whatever they can catch. They are pretty much non-discriminatory. If they can catch it, from birds to antelopes to four-legged beasts, etc., alligators, crocodiles, whatever is available to them. And of course, when food becomes available because it's been, maybe died of natural causes or hit by lightning or whatever, they will of course take advantage of that. Well, then God continues with Job to ask him about in verse 41 of chapter 38, who provided for the raven his food? When his young ones cry out unto God, they wonder for lack of meat. And so God asked Job, what about the ravens, the crows? And of course, a very common bird, very common animal for us in the United States. I know that Springfield, Ohio has its fair share of crows and ravens, just like we do here in West Virginia. And if you start studying those animals, you find that they are tremendously intelligent. Raven intelligence has been studied for many years, and it is considered to be one of the most intelligent birds that God created. One of the animals that has the ability to remember. They even remember where food is. They remember where if they store food, they remember where it's at. They have the ability to solve problems, to analyze them, to look at it, and then to learn from that experience so that the next time they come across that problem, they know how to solve it. They have a reasoning ability. They can reason through problems from past learning. They have the ability to count, and that's still under study. But it appears that ravens know that if they're given a problem where they have to pick something that has 5 items in it in order to get food, if they push the button with the 5 items in it, then they will receive the food. But if they do 4 or 3 or 1 or 10, then they don't. So are they able to count? We simply don't know yet what their intelligence is. And so they've also proven that the ravens have the ability to remember. They can remember individuals. They have facial recognition and are capable of looking at people and saying, I remember him. He's the one that did this. And they will have sentries and guards that if they're at a food source, we throw some table scraps over into the woods in our backyard, and the crows will come and use that, eat that food. But it's almost impossible to sneak out of the house without them seeing us because they've got a sentry that is above them. They communicate very well, and while the noise that they make, as annoying to us, it obviously has a meaning to them. And so raven intelligence and its ability to hunt, its ability to learn, its ability to adapt, and its ability to reason certainly are a testament to God's power and ability when he created these animals. Well, the horse, God asked Job in verse 19, hast thou given the horse strength? Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? He paweth in the valley and rejoiceth in his strength. He goeth on to meet the armed men. He swalloweth, in verse 23 and 24. He swalloweth up the ground with fierceness and rage. Neither believeth he that it is the sound of the trumpet. And so we know that those of you that have maybe been around horses a good deal know of the strength and the power and the fearlessness of horses. And that's why, of course, their domestication has allowed us to use them in times of war and times of battle. And this goes clear back into the days of the Spanish conquistadors and even into Europe. These animals were used by mankind for purposes of function. Well, in verse 13, and I skipped over this one, but we see God asking Job about the peacock and the ostrich. Gavest thou the goodly wings unto the peacock, or the wings and feathers unto the ostrich? God's asking Job about, this animal, this bird called the ostrich, laying its eggs in the ground, or on the ground, and warmeth them in the dust. And so we see that the ostrich, a tremendously amazing animal, of course being one of the several flightless birds that God designed, that God created, and yet while you may think that they would be birds with their ability to fly, certainly make it difficult to catch them. But ostriches certainly are well able to defend themselves, and even their young. And if you've ever seen ostrich eggs, the size of them, and the fact that they can incubate them on the ground and to keep the young alive. And of course, the feathers of the peacock are amazing in their beauty, their color, their patterns, and again, the evolutionists would have to believe it was purely by accident. Well, in verse 26, God asked Job, doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom, and stretch forth her wings towards the south? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command, and make her nest on high? She dwelleth and abideth on the rock, upon the crag of the rock, and the strong place. From thence she seeketh the prey, and her eyes behold afar off. Now, we're not going to have time to get into the vision abilities of the hawks and the eagles, but from 100, 200 yards up in the air, from a half a mile away, they can see objects, they can see prey, they can see mice, snakes, things moving on the ground that would be well beyond the ability of a human to do so. Stretching forth her wings towards the south. By thy wisdom, in other words, God wanted to know from Job the ability that these animals have to fly. And of course, we know many of the raptors, the birds of prey, and many of the animals like the buzzards and the vultures and animals like that soar for hours upon hours, catching the thermals of the wind, and never having to beat their wings. The feathers, the hollow bones, the muscle structure, the respiratory system, their lungs. And many people, many scientists today, evolutionists today, are saying that, well, the birds, the hummingbird is just a dinosaur. That's the closest relative to a Tyrannosaurus rex. Well, don't believe that, because they have two completely different types of respiratory systems. Because birds have to be able to absorb oxygen at such a level that they breathe in a circular pattern, where the dinosaurs like alligators, crocodiles, turtles, the reptiles that are alive today, breathe in the same fashion that we do, an in and out motion, in, stopping, and then out. And we don't have to produce nearly or deliver as much oxygen as a bird needs to. Well, and of course, as I mentioned, the tremendously complex structure of the feathers, and this is an hour-long lesson in and of itself. Where did these feathers come from? Well, they are the split ends of dinosaur scales. Well, that assumes that a feather is a very non-complex structure, and there could not be anything further from the truth. And they had to have this ability instantly. What good would it do for millions of years to lizards and reptiles climbing up trees, jumping off to get away, and jumping down, and as they did that, breaking the edges of their scales and then producing feathers? That would be of no advantage for millions of years to the animals that was happening to. The heart rate, the movement of blood through the body, their nervous system controls. Let me say this as I move on. If anybody ever calls you a bird brain, consider it a compliment, because the ability that birds have to migrate is astounding. The longest migratory route is over 23,000 miles one way, from the North Pole to the southern tip of Argentina, South America. 23,000 miles one way, and then in the spring, when spring comes in the northern hemisphere, the Arctic tern will return back to the same nest on the ground 23,500 miles later. interestingly enough, and again I have to be careful not to go on too long with any one of these because I easily could, but with the Arctic Tern, the mother will leave the North Pole, the Arctic region above the Arctic Circle in Canada and Alaska, start flying, migrating to the south tip of America, leaving her baby behind. The baby will then fatten up, continue to build up strength, and then will fly and make the same journey and land on the same island that the mother is on. And so, amazing ability. So as I said, if anybody ever calls you a bird brain, take it as a compliment. That is certainly showing us that God's ability to build these quote-unquote instincts into these birds is nothing short of incredible. We want to spend just a little bit more before we get into the dinosaurs, the behemoth. But the bird ability to migrate like that is amazing because in many cases these flights are occurring over water. That means no resting places, no time to stop. They have actually now seen that birds have the ability to fly and to migrate while they're asleep. Now, they also have GPS built in. We have phones now that have GPS locators, and we have cameras that have GPS locators in them that are using a system of satellite signals coming from stationary positions in the low Earth's orbit that we use to navigate by. Well, I got news for you. God created inside of the tiny brain of a bird the same ability. Now, you dissect the bird's brain, you look at it carefully, you can't see the GPS structure, but it is actually there. It is present in the bird's brain, its ability to use the magnetic poles of the Earth, to use the sun, to use the location of the sun, even to use prevailing wind currents. And this information is passed from mother to offspring without any, that mother Arctic Tern did not leave for her baby a map showing, okay, this is where you go, this is what you'll feel when you get there. You'll be able to tell the feeling the magnetic pull of the Earth that you need to be flying. No, that's not what happens. God has created them with that ability. And so we certainly see that from the feathers of the peacock and the ostrich and the intelligence that the ostrich has, from the ability of the hawk and the other predatory birds and the other birds to migrate in worldwide pattern across the world is simply beyond the scope and understanding of humans to be able to figure out. Well, let's move on then into Job chapter 40, beginning in verse 15 and following through the end of that chapter. And I encourage you to read this. I'm not going to have trouble, I'm going to have trouble. I'm not going to have the ability to cover each one of these characteristics of this animal called behemoth. And God tells Job, behold now, look over there, Job. I think that's exactly what God did. I don't think God appeared to Job, but I think verbally, out of the whirlwind, God looked over and would have indicated, Job, behold now, look at. Now I believe that this animal, behemoth, was standing somewhere where Job could see it, or certainly knew exactly what this behemoth was. Now, what is the behemoth? The question has plagued linguists and interpreters of the ancient languages and converting it into Greek and English, and we still don't know for sure, because whatever it is, there is no counterpart, there is no animal like it on earth today. And that is the one thing that appears in this. But let's read a few verses. We're going to begin at verse 15 of Job chapter 40 and read down to verse 19. And we'll pick up some of the major characteristics of these animals. God says, behold now behemoth, which I have made with thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the navel of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his bones, or of his stones, are wrapped together. His bones are as strong pieces of brass. His bones are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the ways of God. He that made him can make his sword approach unto him. And then God continues through the rest of that chapter to describe this animal, this animal that God calls the chiefest of the ways of God. This was the best. This was the biggest. This was the largest of the animals that God created for the earth around Job at the time. And so whatever this animal was, Job was familiar with it. Well, one of the things we see is that he eateth grass like an ox. So he was an herbivore. He ate plants. And of course, we know that the animals such as the sauropods, these are the dinosaurs that roamed the earth at one time. And I'm not going to discount the possibility that there may still be. Olomobimbe in the Congo and Africa and several others from around the world. Reports of modern man and natives of those countries, of those regions, having seen animals that fit this description. But they eat grass, they eat plants like an ox. Later in the description, God talks about Behemoth being able to suck up the water, suck up a river, and being able to not be overwhelmed by it. And of course, his massive body, his head being, maybe 40, 50 feet off the ground, and his tail stretching 100 to 150 feet. We see the animals such as the brontosaurus, and back when I was young, the brontosaurus, the Fred Flintstone worked off of in the quarry, and Dino, his pet dinosaur, were sauropods. The brontosaurus, well, that went out of favor for many years, and they didn't think there was such an animal called brontosaurus because of poor collection of skulls and skeletons. But now they have reestablished brontosaurus as being an actual animal because of further skeletons, further study. Even though man believed the brontosaurus existed, took him out of the dinosaur classifications, but now has had to put him back because they have more accurately studied the fossils that are present in the ground. And so, but Seismosaurus, Titanosaurus, etc. He moveth his tail like a cedar. God describes for Job this animal, and it's like he has a tail that's as big as a cedar tree. Well, the cedars that Job would have been familiar with, if you look at the way the sauropods are drawn, and you look at the skeletons in the museums, and you see that there obviously were massive, massive creatures. The trees that Job would have been familiar with, the trees of that region, the cedar trees. This is a cedar of Lebanon, found on the grounds of Blenheim Castle in the United Kingdom. I had the opportunity on 2 different occasions when I spoke at Oxford University in England to be able to go and stand and touch a cedar of Lebanon. And you can see from the photograph, I took a picture here of this tree. You can see the size of the people. And I believe this particular tree, I heard him say that it would take 12 to 13 people, depending on their arm span, to hold hands to stretch around this tree. So the cedars of Lebanon were incredibly large structures. They were huge. Now, the question of what Behemoth was, if you read in the margins of some of your Bibles, comments that man has made, not inspiration by God, but comments that man has made, say that the Behemoth was an elephant. Now, while we know elephants are extremely amazing creatures, their trunks and their memories and their emotions and their sheer size and bulk is amazing, unquestionable. Right? But when you look at their tails, you begin to see a problem. Doesn't look much like a cedar tree. Well, or it's a water horse. Water horse is simply a name for a hippopotamus. And so the question is that what an elephant, is God describing for Job? Behold now, Behemoth, was he describing for Job an elephant, which would be one of the chiefest of the ways of God, certainly what we see on earth today, other than maybe the blue whale and some of those creatures. But look at the tail. You can see the baby elephant in the picture holding on to the tail of the mother. Well, if that's the tail that moveth like a cedar, like the cedars of Lebanon, no. That might be a cedar switch. You go up high enough in that tree and you break off a switch, it's about 2 or 3 feet long, break off a limb, it's about 2 or 3 feet long, ending with the needles and the leaves of the tree. That might be the size of the elephant's tail. But that certainly wasn't the tail of the animal that God described. He described it as moveth it, like when he moves it, it's like a cedar tree. If the behemoth was here in the building with me today in Belington, if he were to swing his tail, the 3 rows of pews would just go flying everywhere because this animal was huge. Well, what about a hippopotamus? Well, the hippopotamus tail isn't anywhere near the cedar, the tree, like the trees of Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. The tail of a hippopotamus is only about a foot long. And while they can use them very effectively, especially for marking territories, and they do that by spreading feces and dung around, by flipping their tail very quickly back and forth, and God has designed them with the ability to use the tail that they have very effectively, but it's not certainly able to move its tail like a cedar tree. And so certainly I don't believe that the water horse, the hippopotamus, or the elephant fits the description that God has given us of the behemoth. Well, here's a cartoon. Can you imagine what an elephant would look like and how he would be able to function? If he was dragging around the tail that would look like a cedar tree, one of the cedars of Lebanon, or a hippopotamus, probably wouldn't be nearly as effective at being the animals that they are today. Well, God said that he moved his tail like a cedar, and you can see that these trees, which, if this animal is 70 feet high, 80 feet high at his head, and 150 feet long, he certainly would easily dwarf and be able to do serious damage. I can imagine a fight between 2 males, 2 Titanosauruses, or Argentinosaurus, which are the largest, Seismosaurus, are the largest of the sauropods. Now, they've also found skeletons of species that they believe were no bigger than a cow, these types of animals. So there obviously were some smaller dinosaurs of this type, the sauropods, than the gigantic pieces. Well, God describes his bones as pieces of brass, as strong as iron, in verse, bars of iron in verse 18 of chapter 40. Well, you can see from the diagram this is a thigh bone, and that's a normal-sized human being silhouette there. And you can see that just the thigh bone, that's the femur, that's the bone here connecting the hip to the lower leg bones at the knee. And you can see that on the right-hand picture, you can see a sauropod bone being extracted from the ground. Again, probably the thigh bone. And you can see, compared to the man who is there helping to extract, helping to collect this particular bone, you can see the size, and that's just one bone of his leg. So you take a 6 to 10 foot tall bone of the hip bone, or thigh bone, excuse me, and then you take the lower bones. His legs would have been probably 12, 15 feet high. All right, that's taller than most of the ceilings in most buildings. Our building here is only 16 feet from the floor to the peak. And so from where I'm standing, it's about 12 feet. And yet that's the one leg bone. That's the size of just his leg, one of the rear legs of these animals. So certainly we know that the hippopotamus, the elephant, are indeed large, amazing creatures, but certainly their bones are not as strong as pieces of brass or bars of iron. And so vastly different. He's the chief of the ways of God. And that by itself is an amazing statement. All right? This animal is the things that God has done in the animal kingdom. Whatever this animal behemoth was, certainly fit into the category that God himself describes it as the chief of the ways of God. And so this is in the things that God does. You need to look at Job. You need to look at this animal and realize that there's none bigger, there's none larger, there's none stronger than the behemoth. Now, again, science, modern science, has struggled to figure out what behemoth was from the standpoint of how to, how to decide, because, of course, the evolutionary biologists have established, quote unquote, established, that humans and dinosaurs existed a minimum of 69 million years apart. Well, I don't believe that to be the case at all. Job saw a dinosaur. God pointed out to Job a dinosaur, a sauropod, Diplodocus, Brontosaurus, etc. Hollywood was right back in the 30s, 40s and 50s when I was growing up in the early 60s, when Fred Flintstone had a pet dinosaur. That could have been Job. That could have been, that could have been a very realistic depiction of the life of Job and his children as they looked out and saw the sauropod dinosaurs as the chief of the ways of God, walking across and eating plants and interacting on an everyday basis. Did Noah have a behemoth, a dinosaur on the ark? Absolutely, he did. And it would be no problem at all, because God didn't tell Noah, I'm going to send you the biggest of all the animals I've got. No, he didn't say that. He said, I'll send you 2 or 7, depending on the type of clean or unclean animal. And so God could have easily sent 2 small brontosauruses. Now, where did they go? Why don't they exist today in large numbers? Well, the world that then was perished, being overflowed with water. The world that Noah saw when he got on the ark and the world that he saw when he got off the ark were 2 different places. And certainly while those 2 brontosauruses or seismosauruses went off of the ark, they were not able to survive. Now, could there be a few still linger, like in the Congo, the jungles of the Congo in Africa? Absolutely, because that's only been 4,500 years ago. That's not been that long. The original creation of Leviathan and Adam and Eve was 6,000 years, give or take a few years. Certainly no more than 10,000 years at the very longest possibility of inaccurate genealogies. But certainly 6,000 years, 4,000 years after the flood, there could still be lingering in the oceans. A plesiosaur, there could still be in the oceans, or in the land masses, a brontosaurus type animal, a sauropod. Of course, we do see, and again, I can't go on and on, but I do have multiple. But we can see here an Inca burial stone showing humans interacting with, and I believe this happens to be a battle between a sauropod and humans, obviously. And these are from South America, these Inca burial stones. And you can look those up on Google, Inca burial stones, and these rocks carved by the Mayans and the Peruvians long ago, 4,000 years ago, depict normal life, and they also depict creatures that are today classified as dinosaurs long before dinosaurs were ever discovered. Well, in chapter 41, the entire chapter, and again, we don't have time in this, I've got 6 minutes to go in the class tonight, but in chapter 41, and I'd encourage you to read the entire chapter, going to read just a few verses, beginning in verse 1. God asked Job, canst thou draw out Leviathan with an hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put a hook in his nose, or a bore in his jaw with a thorn? Will he make supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Wilt thou take him for a servant forever? Wilt thou play with him as with a bird, or wilt thou bind him for thy maidens? Can you make a pet out of this animal, Job? Leviathan was obviously something, when you read the description of Leviathan in chapter 41, it was obviously an incredible animal. It was not one that would be easily attained, or that would be easily tamed by mankind. Leviathan appears, as you continue to read, it appears that it was an ocean-dwelling creature. And so we see, we'll read, pick up again in verse 14 and read down to verse 22 and look at some of the characteristics. Verse 14, who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. His scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. One is so close to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together that they cannot be sundered. By his sneezings a light does shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. And so we see God describing here something that certainly, thankfully, we don't have today. His scales are his pride. They're so close together that no space can come between them. This is the scales of a snake, of a reptile. And you can see the close nature of their binding together. They're so close together that certainly water and air can't get between them. This is the scales, close-up pictures of the scales of an alligator or crocodile. Again, there's the only reason, I'll make a short aside here, the only reason an alligator or a crocodile is not called a dinosaur is that they did not go extinct. They did not die off. And so we find them in the same fossil layers. We find them actually with dinosaur fossils, and I have seen that in person up close at the Smithsonian in their paleontology section behind the scenes where they were taking dinosaur skeletons out of rock, and they had an alligator, species of alligator in that same rock. And the person doing the work said, I asked how would it be different from today as alligators, and he said you couldn't tell the difference. And so the scales of an alligator and crocodile, that, folks, would be what it would be like to look at the skin, to look at the body of a Leviathan. And certainly I believe that that's the case. Well, Leviathan, obviously, his teeth are terrible round about. He lived in the ocean, talks about making the seas boil in part of that chapter. And so you can read that. What was he? A fire-breathing dragon? Well, that's what God describes for Job. All right? His eyes in verse 18. When he sneezes, a light shines forth. Out of his mouth goes burning lamps. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. I can imagine, whenever you see the first sunrise come up over the horizon, and these beams of light, maybe here in West Virginia, passing through the mountaintops or the treetops, and you see these beams of light maybe shining into the fog and the mist of early morning. That's what I believe it was like for Job whenever God described this to Job. By his sneezings, a light does shine. Every time he sneezes, light comes out. Out of his mouth goes burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. His breath can kindleth coals. He can start a fire, just like a fire-breathing dragon. Now, we're within a minute of my time being up. You can go to the YouTube, and I've got an entire lesson on the science of Job, on dinosaurs in the Bible, and explain this in more detail. But there are animals today that have capabilities that are much greater even than Leviathan, in that they're able to produce explosions of superheated hot gases at 212 degrees. And so I would encourage you, as our time runs out for this lesson, I would encourage you to read all of chapter 41. It is real. There is nothing unscientific about Job chapter 41, 40, and 41 with the Behemoth and Leviathan. And the evolutionary story simply does not hold water. And I would encourage you to continue to believe what God has said in the book of Job, and of course, for our lives, about how we need to be faithful to Him to have eternal salvation. Thank you for your time today. If you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me, and I'll be happy to help any way I can.